Most Americans know very little about the workings of the U.S. Supreme Court or its members, but mention Justice Clarence Thomas and you're likely to start an argument. He is the court's only African American and its most conservative member. He is arguably the most influential black man in the country, yet reviled by many in his own race for his opposition to government programs intended to help minorities. Most people know very little about him, their opinions shaped by his bitter confirmation battle in which he was accused of sexually harassing a former employee named Anita Hill. Now, 16 years later, he's written a memoir called My Grandfather's Son, which lays bare a remarkable life and the events that shaped it. Supreme Court justices are private people who rarely give interviews, and Justice Thomas doesn't think much of the press. But he gave us 7 days of his life to talk about all of it.
It's fascinating that there's so many people now who will make judgments based on what you look like. I'm black, so I'm supposed to think a certain way. I'm supposed to have certain opinions. I don't do that. You don't create a box and put people in and then make a lot of generalizations about them.
There's some misconceptions about you. You agree?
I think there are misconceptions about all of us. And there's been an effort over the last 15, 20 years to create this perception of me. And you can't argue that that's been, in large part, successful.
He is often dismissed as a man of little accomplishment, an opportunistic black conservative who sold out his race, joined the Republican Party, and was ultimately rewarded with an affirmative action appointment to the nation's highest court. A sullen intellectual lightweight, so insecure that he rarely opens his mouth in oral arguments. The problem with the characterization is that it's unfair and untrue.
These conceptions or misperceptions, you call them, have accumulated because you haven't really addressed them. You haven't talked about them.
My job is to write opinions. I decide cases and write opinions. It is not to respond to idiocy and critics who make statements that are unfounded. That's not mean that people shouldn't have constructive criticisms, but it should be constructive. And whether or not I'm black or not, that's just silliness. That is not worth responding to.
How much of your life is determined by your race?
I don't know. I'm black. You know, how much of your life is determined by being male? I have no idea. I'm black. That's a fact of life. I'm 5 feet 8.5 inches tall. I don't know how much of my life is determined by being 5 feet 8.5 inches tall. It's just a part of who I am.
But you think of yourself as a black man?
I'm a man. I'm a man, first and foremost. I'm a citizen of this country, and I happen to be black. I am a human being.
Thomas believes the Constitution is colorblind, and he is part of an emerging majority on the court that believes laws granting preferential treatment based on race should be struck down. But it's Thomas who has been vilified by the civil rights establishment, in part because he is black and because he is viewed as having benefited from some of the very programs he now opposes. At best, they consider him a hypocrite. At worst, a traitor to his own people.
You've been successful, you've moved on, you don't care about people in your race.
Oh, that's silliness.
You do care.
Oh, obviously I do. Come on. You know, but it's none of their business. How much does Justice Scalia care about Italians? Did you ask him that? Did anybody ever ask him? Give me a break. Do I help people? Absolutely. Do I love helping black people? Absolutely, and I do. But do I like helping all people? Yes. In particular, I like helping people who are disadvantaged. Is disadvantage the exclusive province of blacks? No.
Whether you agree with him or not, he is thoughtful, provocative, and unpretentious. Not at all the person you might expect.
What kind of an engine's this got in it?
This has got an 8V92 Detroit diesel. It's got an 8V92.
One of his passions is this 40-foot-long motorhome that he and his wife use to explore the United States in their downtime. The U.S. Marshals who protect Justice Thomas wouldn't let us show you the outside of it for security reasons, since he's been known to put up overnight in Walmart parking lots.
You find this relaxing?
Oh, yeah. It's away from the sort of the meanness that you see in Washington. You get here with just the regular folks, and it's so pleasant.
But this trip was business and the route familiar. We were headed down Route 17 towards Savannah, where his long journey to the Supreme Court began. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas was born in a shack in the isolated backwaters of the American South in 1948 on a 25-acre peninsula known as Pinpoint, Georgia. It was settled by freed West African slaves known as gullahs or geechees, who lived off shellfish in the marshes and maintained a distinct culture well into the 20th century.
With their own dialect?
With our own dialect, our own language. And it made English, learning standard English, a little bit difficult.
His father deserted the family when Thomas was 2. His mother worked in this cinder block building, shucking oysters and picking crabs for the restaurants in Savannah, while Thomas caught minnows and practiced skipping oyster shells.
This is what we did. I mean, this is, kids now have video games. This is what we spent our time doing. They still got it.
The house he lived in is long gone, but the oak tree that was behind it is still here.
Tell me about the house. I mean, what kind of a house was it?
It was, as we used to like to say, it was poor but clean. Mm-hmm. I mean, it wasn't much to it, and there was no electricity.
Indoor plumbing?
No, goodness, no. There was an outhouse that we shared with some other families.
When he was 6, the house in Pinpoint burned down, and his mother moved Thomas and his brother to a tenement in Savannah, trading rural poverty for urban squalor.
You paint a pretty tough picture of that year in Savannah, living in the tenements. What was it like?
It was raw sewage in the backyard. It was cold in the winter. I mean, it was one of the most miserable times of my early life.
But his circumstances and his life were about to change. His mother, who was making $10 a week as a maid, couldn't make ends meet and decided to send Clarence and his brother off to live with her father.
My mother packed our bags, told us we were going to go over to my grandparents' house a few blocks away.
When he got to the front door, he was met by his grandfather, Myers Anderson, a barely literate but frugal and industrious man who owned a truck and eked out a modest existence delivering fuel oil and firewood. He was a towering presence who still looms over Thomas's life.
Do you remember the first things your grandfather said to you?
He said, the damn vacation's over, and he meant it. And there would be rules and regulations. Some of the rules were that my grandmother was always right. That meant him, too.
Right.
And he would say, old man Kant is dead. I helped bury him. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. He felt very, very strongly that nothing was impossible. Or he would say everything's possible with elbow grease or hard work. We wound up believing that we could accomplish anything.
Thomas says his grandfather was the greatest man he ever met, and in tribute named his memoir, My Grandfather's Son. But he didn't necessarily feel that way when he was growing up. His life was consumed by endless chores and regular duty on his grandfather's delivery truck. Summer vacations were spent working a plot of land that had been deeded to his ancestors after the Civil War, just across the road from the plantation where they had worked as slaves. He and his brother helped build a house, cleared land, picked crops, and learned under his grandfather's tutelage that blisters turned to calluses and plantings into harvests.
So you guys were field hands.
Yeah, if you want to be pleasant about it, you can call us field hands, but we were his laborers. I had got up the nerves of Daddy, you know, slavery's over, and he's not in my damn house.
You knew he loved you.
I knew he cared about us enough to provide for us, to give us discipline, to spend time with us. We were under his wings from the beginning of the day to the end of the day.
And one of the things they learned there was about race. His grandfather was an active member of the NAACP who bailed out civil rights protesters in the 1960s, but he was realistic about the world they lived in.
Did your grandfather ever give you any advice in terms of how to handle yourself with the police or with white people?
Oh, goodness, that was constant. As we got older, particularly as we entered puberty, it was constant. And I remember the day he said, boy, you up in age now, don't you ever look a white woman in the eye. That was the kind of thing you heard.
Did he explain why?
Oh, yeah. Because the point was that you could be accused of you could be accused of anything.
He grew up in the Jim Crow South, using colored bathrooms and attending all-black schools, spending what little free time he had at the Carnegie Library.
This is it. This is the only library we were allowed to come to.
It was segregated?
That's right. This was the black library. It's a haven. I mean, it's a haven from the world that was out there. It was an antidote to the limitations that you had in Savannah. I can't tell you how many of the people who labored in kitchens, people who worked, did the back-breaking chores, the people who didn't have education, who looked me in the eye and say, boy, get your education. Because if you get it in here, nobody can take it away from you.
His grandfather, who was Catholic, agreed and saved enough money to send him to a parochial school. The white nuns there told him all God's children were equal, the only difference the pigment of their skin. Thomas still believes it, and the church had a profound influence on his life.
You thought about being a priest?
Oh, no, I was going to be a priest. I didn't think about it. I thought I had a vocation and went into the seminary when I was 16.
What did your grandfather think of that?
He said, you can't quit. And then he looked me in the face, boy, don't you shame me and don't you shame the race.
Because he knew that you were going into the white world.
Yeah, because we had this enduring kind of vision or hope that if given a chance, we could do as well as anybody. All we had to do is be given a chance.
But by 1968, Thomas had doubts about the priesthood. He'd read the books of James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, and Richard Wright, and began to question the church's commitment to civil rights.
The nail in the coffin of my vocation was in the spring of 1968 when Dr. King was assassinated, and I was going back into the dorm, to my dormitory, and someone said in front of me when we heard that Dr. King had been assassinated, he said, well, that's good, that's, I hope the SOB dies. And that was it. That was the end of the seminary, that was the end of the vocation, that was the end of, for all practical purposes, my Catholic faith.
All you had to do was to tell your grandfather.
I had to go back home. That's the hard part, and tell him. You know, I had made him a promise I wouldn't quit, so I told him. And he immediately kicked me out of the house.
It's pretty harsh.
Harsh is too strong a word. That wasn't him. He was a hard man. You know, he said to me, you let me down. And, you know, you're on your own.
Did you feel guilty? Did you feel like you'd let him down? Were you angry at him?
I think I was angry at everybody. I was angry at the church because the church wasn't aggressively pointing out how immoral racism was. I was upset with my grandfather because he didn't understand what I was going through. I was upset with the country because of the bigotry. And I was upset at probably the submissiveness of blacks and putting up with bigotry. And this was the era when you had the Black Power movement, and that was enticing, it was liberating. And you sort of get swept up in that.
He had always been an honors student and won a scholarship to Holy Cross, where he dressed in Army fatigues and combat boots and joined the Black Student Union. He also graduated near the top of his class and was accepted at the Yale Law School, where he studied alongside future cabinet member Robert Reich, future UN Ambassador John Bolton, and future Supreme Court colleague Samuel Alito.
You were there with some pretty exclusive company.
Maybe they were an exclusive company.
Bill and Hillary Clinton were there at the time?
Yeah, but they weren't president. Maybe they were running for president, but they weren't president then, so.
And you weren't Supreme Court Justice?
No, you didn't know any of that.
But at Yale, Thomas sensed that he was being treated differently by teachers and fellow students. The law school had a program that set aside a certain number of slots for minority students.
And I honestly believed that Yale thought that having a kid who came from working people in the South, who'd grown up through segregation, that this kid who'd prospered, who'd done well, every single place he'd ever been, whether an all-white school, all-black schools, he's always done well, he will do well here. And it will benefit both him and Yale. That's what I thought. Now, that's what you do when you're 21, 22 years of age. You could make a mistake. Well, that isn't what it was converted to.
What was it converted to?
It was converted to, well, you're here because you're black.
Justice Thomas did well at Yale, graduating somewhere in the middle of his class. But he says it was the first time anybody had tried to put him in a box because of his race. And whatever benefits he accrued from being there were tarnished when it came time to graduate.
You know, I was in debt, I needed a job, and I couldn't get a job.
Not even with the Yale Law degree?
I could not get a job. And I just saw the discounting of my degree happen before my eyes.
Why do you think that is?
Well, that degree meant one thing for whites and another thing for blacks.
It was discounted.
It was discounted. That's right.
You write in the book that your Yale degree was worth 15 cents.
Well, you know, Steve, I have still a 15-cent sticker on the frame that my law degree's in. It's tainted, so I just leave it in the basement.
Thomas finally found a $10,000 a year job in Jefferson City, Missouri, working for the state's Attorney General, John Danforth.
And the biggest negative was that it didn't pay much money, and he was a Republican. But I had to swallow hard, go out to Missouri, and work for a dreaded Republican.
You were still a liberal Democrat at that point.
I was never a liberal. I was radical. I was cynical. I was negative, but I was never a liberal. I always saw that as too lukewarm for me.
Thomas would follow Danforth to Washington, and in 1980 switched parties to vote for Ronald Reagan, whose belief in hard work and personal initiative, Thomas says, were more consistent with the way he had been brought up. But in many ways, he was still a radical. Over time, he came to believe that government programs designed to help blacks were ultimately demeaning and detrimental to them. He rejected decades of civil rights dogma on the grounds that it created a cult of victimization and implied that blacks required special treatment in order to succeed, postponing the day when all men and women would truly be viewed as equals.
You're a huge believer in self-reliance, and I get sort of a subtext from you, tell me if I'm wrong, that you think that the black community could use a few more leaders preaching that.
You've been down here long enough to see who raised me and what my grandfather, what approach would he take? It'd be get out there and work. The problem for me isn't that everybody agrees with him or me, but that they think they have the exclusive province of how to approach it, that I am to be destroyed because I won't drink that Kool-Aid, or because I don't follow in this cult-like way something that blacks are supposed to believe. I have an opinion. It seems as though the problem with me and other people with our opinions is that we are veering away from the black gospel that we're supposed to adhere to.
When we come back, Justice Thomas talks about life on the Supreme Court, abortion, his confirmation hearings, and Anita Hill. Shortly after Clarence Thomas moved to Washington in 1979, he was pressed into service by a Reagan administration anxious to attract black conservative talent. Over the next 10 years, he was Undersecretary of Education for Civil Rights, served 2 terms as chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals in Washington. And after just 15 months there, his name was floated as a possible replacement for Thurgood Marshall, a hero of the civil rights movement and the only African-American justice on the Supreme Court.
When it first dawned on you, I mean, what was your reaction that you might end up on the Supreme Court?
Pick the other guy.
Really?
It was, oh gosh, I had already bitten off of more than I could chew. I was tired. I had been nominated when I was nominated to this court. That was 5 nominations in 10 years.
In July of 1991, he was told to fly to Kennebunkport, Maine, to have a chat with President Bush. Thomas assumed it was an interview about the Supreme Court vacancy.
He said, "Can you and your family make it through a difficult confirmation?" I should have said no at that point, but that would have been the coward's way out. I said yes. Then he asked me, he said, "If you go on the court, can you call them as you see them?" And I said yes. And then he looked me in the eye and he said, "I will never criticize any decision you make." And he said, at 2 o'clock, I'm going to nominate you to the Supreme Court. Let's go have lunch.
I thank all of those who have helped me along the way and who've helped me to this point and this moment in my life, especially my grandparents who are...
His nomination immediately came under attack. President Bush had called Thomas the best qualified candidate for the job and said that race had not been a factor in his selection. But not even Thomas was sure if he believed it. He was only 43 years old with barely a year's experience on the bench, but he was confident he could do the job.
You had no illusions about how difficult it was going to be to get confirmed.
I eventually did have illusions because as bad as I thought it would be, I had no idea how bad it would be.
Thomas spent 3.5 months preparing for the hearings and survived a 5-day grilling by the Senate Judiciary Committee about his conservative views on affirmative action, welfare, capital punishment, school prayer, and abortion. The nomination was sent to the full Senate, where it appeared Thomas had enough votes to be confirmed.
And then what happened?
Next round of attacks that I could never have anticipated took place.
Anita Hill.
Yeah.
Here she comes.
Anita Hill, a former employee of Thomas's, had submitted a confidential statement to the Senate Judiciary Committee alleging that Thomas had sexually harassed her 10 years earlier when both of them were single. The FBI had already investigated the allegations and given the Judiciary Committee what was called an inconclusive report. The committee decided not to pursue the matter. But 2 days before the full Senate was expected to confirm Thomas, Hill's statement was leaked to the media.
It was only after they had been leaked illegally to the public, in the press, that then it's out of hand. It's in the feeding frenzy.
At the minimum, we need to see a delay of this nomination.
Under pressure from women's groups and congressional Democrats, Anita Hill was summoned before the Judiciary Committee to testify before live television cameras. More than 20 million households tuned in to watch the proceedings, which were more titillating than the soap operas.
After a brief discussion of work, he would turn the conversation to a discussion of sexual matters. His conversations were very vivid.
You denied all of the allegations.
Oh, absolutely. From day one, it didn't happen. I mean, so if somebody makes a broad allegation against you, what would you do?
Ask him to prove it, I guess.
Yeah.
Was the Anita Hill that testified on the Hill the Anita Hill that you knew at EESC?
She was not the demure, religious, conservative person that they portrayed. That's not the person I knew.
Who was the person you knew?
She could defend herself, let's just put it that way. And she did not take slights very kindly. And anyone who did anything, she responded very quickly.
Didn't take 10 years.
It didn't take 10 minutes.
In the book, he remembers Anita Hill as an average employee whose behavior could sometimes be irritating, rude, and unprofessional, which he attributed to her youth. He was asked to write a number of recommendations for her and helped advance her career. And he speculates that she got swept up in events and succumbed to a combination of ego, ambition, and immaturity.
It did not occur.
When it came time for him to publicly respond to the allegations, Thomas turned the tables on his interrogators and, for all intents and purposes, ended the debate.
This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. It is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves. And it is a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, you will be lynched, destroyed, caricatured by a committee of the U.S. Senate rather than hung from a tree.
Why did you use that language? I mean, why a high-tech lynching?
If somebody just wantonly tries to destroy you, if somebody comes in and just drags you out of your house and beats the hell out of you, what is it?
What do you want people to think about those allegations? What is it important?
I really, at this point, I think most well-meaning people understand it for what it was. It was a weapon to destroy me. Clear and simple.
Thomas says the hearings brought him back to his Catholic faith and that he couldn't have gotten through them without the support of his wife, Virginia.
How hard was that for you?
That was the hardest thing I've ever gone through.
Did you ever doubt it?
No, we talked honestly about what was happening in his life back then, but I didn't doubt him, no.
Were you angry?
Oh, yeah. I would say I was angry. I was angry. I mean, you feel all the emotions when you're falsely accused.
Yeah.
I, Clarence Thomas.
Thomas was eventually confirmed, but he took no personal joy in the outcome.
The process harmed her, it harmed me, and we see sort of the precedent for this kind of thing begin to even harm people like President Clinton. Things are out of control.
After this whole horrible experience, you won.
Won what? What was the game? There was no game, Steve. This wasn't about winning anything. This wasn't a football game. This was about our country. This was about a process. This was about our courts. This was about our Constitution. Who won?
Well, you know, it's about a seat on the Supreme Court of the United States. They don't come open.
That's not a holy grail for me, Steve.
Was it worth it in the end?
I think it is always worth it to stand on principle, no matter what the ultimate goal is. Wrong is wrong, even if it was over a penny.
Thomas believes the real issue being fought over during his confirmation was all but unspoken.
The issue was abortion. That's the issue today. I mean, we can.
This whole thing was about abortion?
Yes, that was the elephant in the room.
In what sense?
That is the issue that people apparently are so upset about that you determine the composition of your Supreme Court and your entire federal judiciary, it seems now.
Your opponents were afraid that you might, at some point, rule against or help overturn Roe v. Wade.
I have no idea what they thought, but they knew one thing. They weren't in charge of me, so I wasn't going to do their bidding.
Thomas believes the issue of abortion is not addressed in the Constitution and should be left to the states to decide. If that becomes the majority view on the court, abortion could be outlawed in 40% of the country.
One of the most surprising things in the book, in it you say, like most Americans, I had mixed emotions about abortion. I wasn't comfortable telling others what to do in that difficult circumstance.
There are tough decisions we have to make in life. And of course we all feel about that. People think that because you might agree or disagree with them on certain things that you don't have that concern about people who are left with tough choices. You do have that concern. But none of that had anything to do with what's in the Constitution. The point is simply this. The Constitution is what matters, not my personal views, whatever they may be. And I don't go around expressing them on that issue.
He's expressed his legal views in more than 300 written opinions, which is about average given his tenure. But he rarely opens his mouth during oral arguments.
The perception is, or the critics will say, it's because you're not smart enough, or you're too insecure, or you're afraid of making a fool out of yourself.
Well, they make fools out of themselves with those kind of comments. Justice Marshall rarely asks questions. Justice Powell rarely asks questions. That's a personal preference. I certainly wouldn't do it to provide histrionics for the media gallery or for other people or for critics. Critics will always be critics.
Over the years, the most vocal and persistent have been elements of the black community, where Thomas feels he has always been misunderstood.
We will not sit by silently while you try to turn back the clock on civil rights and civil liberties and human rights in this country.
They feel that you received some preferential treatment because you were black, and that now you are trying to say that other blacks shouldn't have it, that you pulled the ladder up after you've climbed to the top.
Steve, that's silly. Come on.
This is political reality. You are supercharged.
I don't think that when you're dealing with things that are matters of principle or matters of fact, that you can spend a lot of time worrying about what critics say. You have to do your job. My grandfather never worried about it. You've got to do what's right. You don't engage in this kind of pettiness.
What's it like here on a normal day?
Just like it is right now.
Pretty quiet?
It's quiet like this. You rarely see your colleagues.
Thomas says the court may be closely divided on important ideological issues, but that he's never heard an uncivil word spoken in his 16 years there. He is reportedly one of the most popular people in the building, well-liked by everyone, including his colleagues. Still only 59 years old, he is on track to become one of the longest-serving Supreme Court justices in history.
And this is your grandfather?
Yeah.
With every decision he makes, and every opinion he writes, he thinks about his grandfather, Myers Anderson.
The Supreme Court is a place where a number of justices have changed their views on things. Is it possible that over the next 10 or 15 years that you could change?
My journey has, over the years, been almost that of a prodigal son, where you journey away from your roots in the South. And now I've returned to my roots. And that's why I entitled my book, My Grandfather's Son. I have returned to my grandfather and to the way he raised me. And I think that's home, and that's where I'll stay.